Hi, and welcome to another edition of Newsmakers Journal of the Vaccine Year. It is Tuesday, September 14th, Election Day in California, as astonishing as that may sound. And so we are speaking today with one of my favorite political analysts, former state senator, current grandma, attorney, Renaissance woman, Hannah Beth Jackson. Thanks so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
Doing well, Jerry, and thanks for having me. This is one of those important days, and as we try to sort of make some sense out of the world today, I appreciate your asking for my thoughts.
Well, quick prediction. I mean, it would take an astonishing polling mistake for Gavin Newsom not to defeat this recall, but we may not know. We may know in 2 hours after the polls close. We may not know for 2 weeks or 2 months, but what's your feeling on where things are?
Well, I think once the Democrats woke up to the fact that this was really a possibility, remember, Newsom won the election by, I think, 29 points. I mean, it was just a rout against a Republican who actually tried to talk California values. So I think that Democrats were really very complacent and thought this was silliness, which frankly I think it is, but it has to be taken seriously. And then, frankly, when Larry Elder got in the case and we started spouting stuff that sounded like Donald Trump, and I don't know if I can say worse, but sounding like Donald Trump, people went, "Oh my goodness, could this guy really become governor of the state?" And so I think that the Democrats picked up the pace and have started taking it seriously. And as a result, Democrats outnumber Republicans in the state 2-1. So you don't need all Democrats to vote. We know that the Republican voter is very motivated in this election. I mean, they still think that Trump won the election, and they're angry, they're bitter, they're hostile. They don't want to let facts get in the way of this sort of ideological battle that they have created, and this recall is part of that battle. So the Democrats, I think, are at least the earlier numbers and the current numbers indicate that Democrats have gotten out and voted. And my understanding is the current polling says that Gavin should win by between 16 and 20%.
Yeah, well, my partner in Calbuz and I, Phil Traunstein, and I wrote in May that he would trounce it and he would emerge stronger. And there have been a couple of funny polls since then, but I've never really wavered from that. But let me ask you about two broader issues that I think are raised by this. One is, and you point out, I think Democrats have a 46 to 24% registration advantage over Republicans. But this is not the same Republican Party that you and I grew up with, which was, low taxes, create jobs, stay out of business. This is more of an authoritarian personality cult it's like, what does Trump say? Whatever Trump says, that's what we're for. And it just feels like it's been hollowed out. There were a couple of people on this ballot, Kevin Faulconer, I want to point to, the former mayor of San Diego, who was, I guess, for lack of a better term, sort of a mainstream Republican, but he was never going to get the votes. You were in Sacramento back, before the first ice age. Republican Party.
20 years almost.
Oh, okay,
20 years,
all right.
yes.
But hasn't it really changed in terms of, it used to be a party more about ideas, and now it's really more about personality?
Well, when George W. Bush, who I consider to be a pretty right-wing president, says, "Come on, folks, let's deal in facts and let's disagree respectfully." What's happened, I think, is the politics of fear and irrationality has taken over the Republican Party. And it is not the party of Nelson Rockefeller, who was actually one of my heroes as a kid growing up, or Elliot Richardson, who was the Attorney General of Massachusetts when I was a kid growing up in my home state. This is not the Republican Party that even George W. Bush and the Bush family knew. This has become a cult of anger and bigotry and ignorance. This whole notion of alternative facts. mean, I'm a recovering lawyer. I love to argue, but when you argue with people, they may have a different viewpoint, but you have to start with the same facts, or else there's no place to discuss. There's no difference of opinion to work through and to try to come to common ground. When people simply say this election was fixed, they have no proof. In fact, to the contrary, this past presidential election was one of the cleanest elections we've ever had. That's why no one, after they do all of this investigation and painstaking review, there was nothing that happened in this election to indicate any level of fraud.
But
and yet that's what you keep hearing.
60% of Republicans nationally believe that Trump actually won the election. And it goes to my point, because Trump says, I won the election, even though he clearly lost. Now that becomes kind of an article of faith among Republicans. And we see it already with this recall, where Larry Elder and others are saying, oh, it's rigged. Trump himself says it's rigged. The election hasn't even been held yet, and they're already saying it's rigged.
Well, because their feeling is if I lose, it must have been rigged. It's kind of like you go out and you play baseball and you lose. And you say, oh, the umpires were favoring the other team. Even as you sit there and watch, as the other team hit 10 home runs, and you struck out 26 times out of 27 at bats. Oh, we lost because the game was fixed. That's the same mentality. And what's very scary to me, Jerry, is this comes right out of the totalitarian playbook. If you can undermine democracy, so you take a look at some of the countries of the world where they said the elections are fixed, therefore I'm suspending the elections. Well, that's where we're headed in this country. If people honestly, even though stupidly, I must say, ignorantly, I guess I should say, believe what is not true, because it serves whatever their purpose is, democracy is doomed.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you something on the other side that kind of come up in the course of this recall, and that is the Democratic Party and Latino voters. And I think at one point there was some indication that Democrats were really having trouble motivating Latino voters for here. There's some concern that they're more open to the Republican message. I know you were at an event last week or the week before about this. Talk about that a little bit in terms of, do you think that Latinos are and will remain still a mainstay of the Democratic Party?
Well, when you look at what the Democrats stand for, and you look at the fact that there is a very large percentage in Sacramento of legislators who come from Latino backgrounds, they present the voice of the needs of a very large portion of the state of California. About 40%, I believe, is the population now of Latinx people. And Democrats have done a very poor job articulating what democratic values have been that have been very supportive of the Latino community. We do a terrible job. And when you're a party that doesn't care about the truth, you can say anything you want, say it with a straight face, and people who are busy trying to live their lives and may not necessarily be following politics per se, might start believing that. So one of the things we've been doing is, in talking to the Latino community, is talking about the things that have happened that Gavin Newsom, as our governor, has done to be supportive of the Latino community. Everything from holding off on evictions. We worked very hard on that with this governor to keep people in their homes, even though they were out of work and things had closed down. We provided resources for our Dreamers, for our DACA students who are in college. We now are continuing a policy of providing 2 years of free community college tuition, which has been a godsend for our Latino students who are looking to get that education and get involved in successful careers and the opportunities that America offers, our policies towards trying to protect our immigrant population, things we've done to keep ICE out of our schools and our courtrooms, things that the Republican side has in fact encouraged this kind of harassment, whereas the Democratic side says, no, you can't do this. But it's the kind of thing, unless you let people know, and you get people coming in on the other side saying, oh, you don't want the Democrats are not your friends, we're your friends, that becomes dangerous. So we've got to do a better job because there is a very strong voice for the Latino community. We've also provided and are providing health care for our undocumented immigrants now from 50 years of age or older. I don't think there was a single Republican vote to support that. And yet we, particularly during COVID, need to protect those folks. We protected farm workers and provided those who had come down with COVID housing so that they could stay successfully immunized from their family, or their families could be safe, and that these folks could be quarantined, and making sure that we try to address those problems. This governor sent out folks to vaccinate those in Latino communities who never otherwise would have been able to get the vaccine. I mean, it goes on, and yet
Right.
we don't do a very good job sharing that.
Well, you and I have talked about this a lot, that Democrats are just generally lousy about messaging compared to Republicans. I mean,
Yes.
Republicans are very crisp. They appeal to people's emotions, and Democrats are kind of all over the lot explaining, that this bill and that bill. And I know that's been something you've written about, and we've talked about. To what do you attribute that? Why is that?
Well, I think Democrats in general believe in governing. And so we want to talk about what we're doing. For the Republican side, it's all about this notion of freedom. And they simplify and they misrepresent. Again, when facts don't matter, you can say just about anything. Democrats, on the other hand, we want to explain everything because we believe that if you know what the facts are, you'll be very supportive. And what we don't realize is that while a lot is getting done, it's not perfect, but a lot is being accomplished. The other side has, as you pointed out, they play off of fear and ignorance. And have done and are very effective in that regard. I have to give them credit. They don't, they don't regard the truth, but they do have a message, and they're very, very disciplined in presenting the message.
All right, let's talk about local politics a little bit. Despite my best efforts to draft you for running for mayor, you decided not to do it, and so we're left with the field that we are. You've endorsed James Joyce, your former aide for mayor. Why?
Well, and thank you for pointing out that I was smart enough to ignore your entreaties. I've endorsed James. James worked for me my full 8 years in the Senate. He was my district director for most of those years. I've watched him interact with people. I've watched him take ideas that I suggested. I've watched him create ideas and help me articulate my vision and discuss his vision. And I've been very impressed, A, with his values, B, with his ability to bring people together and to come out with ideas that really can be implemented, that have great practical application, that resonate with the community, that reflect the values of our community. And I think he'll be a fine and excellent leader. And I'd love to see him have the chance.
Yeah. So, I mean, let me just put your average voter hat on for a minute. I mean, if I'm a pollster and I ask you, do you feel optimistic or pessimistic about the direction that the city of Santa Barbara is headed? I mean, how do you feel about where things are after these great crises that we've had, the pandemic, the economic shutdown, the George Floyd reckoning, and so on?
Sure.
What do you think?
Well, I think that we are definitely at sort of an inflection point. I think the country's at an inflection point. So I don't say that Santa Barbara is uniquely situated, but we really need an infusion of optimism, an infusion of vision. We need to be able to articulate what we want the future of this city to be, and then we need people to come together to demonstrate and to create that future. And I think right now we are suffering, as so many other places are, with this kind of contrariness, this lack of civility, which is stunning. Because a democracy can only function if people come together and, as I say, find that sweet spot where we can find our commonality, find a common vision, and work together to achieve it. And right now, boy, we are just at a loss, whether it's the city, the state, the whole idea of vaccines, the whole idea of masks, the whole idea of I say X, therefore you say Y, and the fact that we are like the Tower of Babel. We're talking different languages. Nobody's sitting down trying to talk to each other. And I think James is the kind of person who will bring everybody to the table and say, what are your needs and what are your needs? And how can we come together? How can we get to yes? And right now, nobody's talking to each other. We're all talking over each other. And it's very destructive.
Well, I think, and I don't say it's a problem, but it's certainly a big factor in this city, is obviously we've gone to district elections. And I think typically what happens, and I've covered other places where that's happened, is really at the beginning, things get kind of atomized and people stop looking at the overall good of the city, perhaps, and they're more interested in their district. And so we have only one office holder who is elected citywide, the mayor. And, the current mayor got what, 27%, probably something like that will happen again, whoever wins the election. Do you think that Santa Barbara would be a good place for ranked choice voting?
The jury's out for me on that issue. I don't know. I mean, there are some instances where it's actually worked and some where it hasn't. I'm not sure that ranked voting is the answer. Perhaps what we should have is, at the end of the day, like we do in most elections, a general election where the top two vote getters duke it out for the position. I mean, that worked for years, or didn't work, depending upon, I guess, your perspective. But I think that would force people to be clearer on what their vision is. And it would allow people to really be able to hone in on just what the future of this community is going to look like, and then let people choose which vision they support. That's what elections and democracy is supposed to be all about.
Yeah. No, I do think that's part of the problem, because there's just nobody who's kind of representing everybody, and it's no secret you've had your issues with the Democratic Party, and when the Democratic Party endorses somebody and they go all out, it matters. They have volunteers, they have precinct walkers, but yet it's still a slice of the community. It's not the overall community that's
Well, good leadership, though, Jerry, it requires that you bring all of the stakeholders to the table and you find out what each one of them needs. And you try to figure out if there's a way to give them what they need and still accomplish the goal you're trying to accomplish. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't, but you have to try. And I think that's what good leadership is. Now, in today's world, people are just sitting there, arms crossed, eyes crossed, everything crossed, and saying no. Just saying no. And democracy will not survive if that's our attitude. We used to find common ground. We didn't always agree where we ended up, but we at least tried through the process to get there. And in democracy, you're never going to have everybody agreeing. I mean, why is it that China's been able to build high-speed rail all over China? That's because they decide, we're destroying your neighborhood. We're building this. We're not asking you for permission. We're doing it. And that's what you get with an authoritarian government. And frankly, people say, gosh, I wish we could be more like a country that says this is what's going to happen, and they do it. But we are a democracy, and we believe in the ability of people to have a say in what their future is going to look like. And that's the democratic process. It's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it's certainly the best that is out there.
All right. Before we leave local politics, explain something to me. I've only lived here for 20 years, and you've been in this a lot longer. The Democratic Party and the Democratic women very often have very, very different people that they endorse, very different candidates. What's the difference there? And as I look around, I mean, there's a lot of office holders, women office holders in this town who were not endorsed by the Democratic Party, were endorsed by Democratic women. Laura Capps, well, I guess she was endorsed the second time, but Kate Ford, and others. What's the difference, and why is there a difference?
Well, it's really hard to say. Democratic women is sort of very independent minded. They are not necessarily affiliated with the state Democratic Party. They have a very independent group of members who don't necessarily care to engage in what we might call democratic politics per se. They look at the candidates, and from whatever is their perspective, based upon the leadership, particularly of the group, they make their decisions according to those particular points of view. They prioritize things that aren't necessarily the same way the party itself prioritizes, but it certainly makes for interesting theater. And I sometimes agree with them, I sometimes don't, but I think we all share basically the same values, good solid democratic values about equality of opportunity, equity, respect for the diversity that is the quilt of our community and of the state, quality education, the importance of government as a force for good. It doesn't always work that way, but certainly the private sector is not the answer without some form of oversight and accountability and regulation. These are sort of good democratic values from my perspective. The ability of people to make their own choices about their reproduction. That's freedom from the perspective of the Democratic side. The need to have reasonable protections because we are all in this together. We are community. But it translates slightly differently depending.
Very artful dodging on that question. I want to give you credit for that. All right, let me. I did a piece on you, cover piece for the Independent. I think it was 2019, your penultimate year in office, and I asked you, what are you going to do when you're out of office? And you said more walks on the beach, and I said, ha ha, and I say, ha ha. Now, a couple of things you've been up to. I read, I think in the Montecito Journal, that you were helping in the fight against Senate Bill 9, Senate Bill 10, which allows these multiple lot splits, is basically the death knell for single family neighborhoods. What was going on with that?
Well, when I was in the legislature, the whole issue of housing is one that has been a real challenge in California. We're about 3 million units short to provide housing for everyone. And the cost of housing continues to go up. And so the question is, what's going on and how do we fix the problem? So SB 9 and 10 say, you know what? One of the fixes is that we are going to prohibit single family zoning. And this has never been something that I thought really was an answer to the problem. I still don't think it's an answer to the problem. And so when the Montecito Association asked me if I would assist them, and I'm doing some consulting, I put up a little shingle, if you will, and I've got a consulting practice that I'm doing, asked me if I would help them try to work to educate people on what 9 and 10 meant, and to try to help them create strategies that would either undermine its success or at least make changes in it to lessen its impact, I was more than happy to do that because I believe that there is a serious problem, but getting rid of single family zoning is not the answer. I mean, we've got all sorts of problems. We've got international investors that have been buying up a lot of property. They own, I think, 30% now of the real estate in California. And so they charge higher rents. The wealthiest 1% are buying up properties. We see it right here in Santa Barbara and all over desirable places in California. That's a supply and demand issue. As long as capitalism survives, people are going to be able to buy what they want, and sellers are prepared to sell based upon the highest price that they can get. But there are things that we should be doing, taking unused, underutilized commercial property, for example, and turning that into housing. We've got our own. I know this was something that caused a bit of a kerfuffle. The MTD owns a valuable piece of property. Why don't we take that and put that into low-income housing for our community, or even workforce housing? Instead, MTD said, no, like everybody else, we want our highest and best price, and that's either creating commercial property or high-end residential property. And these bills, by the way, sort of take away local control. They take away environmental protections. I think they're just a bad idea. And so I was very happy and have been very happy to work with this group and to make it a statewide effort to try to create greater awareness about what the real problems are and to defend against these kinds of legislative efforts that really, I don't think are helpful or going to solve the problem.
Well, no, and unfortunately, I guess they both passed, and I'm assuming that Newsom will sign both of them. And I think part of the problem is, and you know this, that because San Francisco and LA dominate the legislature so much, that's where the policy ideas are often generated, and they gain a lot of steam. And so, this one was suburban, I guess, if you want to put it that way, California, Central Coast, trying to hang on for dear life. But it's not a good development, I don't think, at all.
No, and we were able to get some significant tweaks to this if they will be followed through, and I think raising the public's awareness will, at the end of the day, hopefully allow us to continue the conversation and really go after what the real problems are, and not something that I don't think is going to move the ball forward at all.
All right. Real quick, because I promised I'd get you out on time, but you had you had several, but one in particular piece of legislation that gained a lot of national attention, which was to increase the number of women on corporate boards in California, and it was immediately involved in litigation against it. Can you give us a status report on where that stands?
Yeah, it's been up and down. Lawsuits were filed by these very ultra-conservative organizations. Judicial Watch is one of them. Pacific Justice Foundation, I think, is the other one. And they were challenging this, talk about really poking the bear. When you go after old line corporate America, and the good old boys that have been running this country for a long time, they're not very happy about it. The good news is that even though these lawsuits are moving forward, and we'll see how it all comes out, we've seen groups like Goldman Sachs, the NASDAQ, major investment groups, and CalPERS and CalSTRS saying, what, we are not going to invest in companies that don't recognize the value of this diversity and don't have women and other diverse groups on their boards. And so what's happened is that we are changing the culture. I think we need to do more because the old boys are digging in their heels in some of these instances, but it has had national significance, and we are seeing more and more women being given the opportunity to make these major corporate decisions that do have an impact on the business world. And that's what we really need is a culture shift and the ability of businesses to meet the needs not only of the consumers who purchase their goods and services, 70% of whom are women, but also within the workforce. We have to change the culture of work in the 21st century, and nothing has shown that more clearly than the COVID pandemic.
So while they're being challenged in court, has the legislation gone in, taken effect, or is it frozen? Yes. Yeah, it has.
No, it's in effect. There is currently a request for a preliminary injunction to freeze it that is on the docket now, I think to be heard either later September or early October. You know, with all of the problems associated with the court backlog, theoretically they're supposed to be heard then. They may, it depends on each court, but we are expecting that there will be some results to that coming, forthwith. And hopefully we will continue the battle. I happen to think it's constitutional, the way we framed the debate, the way we framed the bill. Again, it allows for boards to expand their size. So we're not going to be kicking men off the boards, which is what their big complaint. You can add people to the board, but you have to reflect the society within which you do business. And we know when you do that, that companies are more profitable, which is why Goldman Sachs, which is why NASDAQ, which is why I think it's BlackRock and other major investors are saying, yes, this is good for business. We want these people on the boards.
Yeah. Okay. Now, are you a defendant, or is the state of California the defendant, or do you have?
No, it's the Secretary of State. It's the Secretary of State who is the enforcement agency for this legislation, who is the defendant in these proceedings.
All right. All right. Hannah Beth Jackson, thank you so much for taking some time to check in with us. It's great to see you again, to catch up a little bit. And you're out there, I know, doing the Lord's work. So you stay safe.
Thank you, Jerry. And thanks for being the curmudgeon that we all love and keeping us all honest in the political world. Thanks.
All right.